The country that Putin fears most is actually China. Yes, you heard that right. China, Russia's supposed strategic partner, the nation with which Moscow has cultivated increasingly close ties in recent years, is actually the source of Putin's deepest long-term anxieties. And when you step back and analyze the situation from multiple angles, this revelation becomes not just believable, but almost inevitable. Let's break down exactly why this is the case, starting with the historical context that shapes Russian thinking about China. Russia and China share the longest land border of any two countries on Earth, stretching over 4,000 kilometers from Mongolia to North Korea. This border has been a source of tension, conflict, and anxiety for both nations throughout modern history. In the 19th century, the Russian Empire seized vast territories from the Qing dynasty through what the Chinese call the unequal treaties. These treaties forced China to cede regions like Outer Manchuria, which includes modern-day Vladivostok and the entire Russian Far East coastal area. To this day, these territorial losses remain a sensitive topic in Chinese historical consciousness. While the current Chinese government has officially recognized these borders, there remains an underlying current of resentment about these historical injustices. And Putin's intelligence services are acutely aware that nationalist sentiment in China could one day turn these old grievances into active territorial claims. The demographic situation along the Russian-Chinese border amplifies these concerns dramatically. The Russian Far East is one of the most sparsely populated regions of any major country on Earth. We're talking about a massive territory roughly the size of the entire European Union, but with a population of only about 6 million people, and that population is declining. Meanwhile, just across the border in northeastern China, there are over 100 million people. The contrast is staggering. Cities like Harbin and Shenyang dwarf anything on the Russian side. This demographic imbalance creates a situation where, in practical terms, China could exert enormous pressure on these territories simply through migration and economic influence, even without any military action. Russian intelligence documents that have been analyzed by Western experts reveal a consistent preoccupation with the Chinese question in the Far East. There are concerns about Chinese economic infiltration, about Chinese workers and businesses gradually dominating the local economy, about the potential for Chinese soft power to erode Russian sovereignty in these remote regions. Putin has quietly been moving military assets to the region, modernizing bases, and conducting exercises specifically designed to defend against a potential Chinese incursion, all while publicly maintaining the facade of the Russia-China strategic partnership. Now let's talk about the economic dimension, because this is where Russia's vulnerability becomes truly apparent. On the surface, Russia and China appear to be natural economic partners. Russia has vast natural resources, particularly oil, natural gas, timber, and minerals, while China has the manufacturing capacity and the enormous market that Russia needs. They've signed major energy deals, they've increased bilateral trade, and they've worked to reduce their dependence on Western financial systems. But here's the problem from Russia's perspective. This relationship is fundamentally asymmetric, and it's becoming more so every year. China's economy is roughly 10 times the size of Russia's economy. 10 times. In terms of GDP, China is competing with the United States for global economic leadership, while Russia's economy is smaller than Italy's or Canada's. This massive disparity means that in the Russia-China relationship, Russia is increasingly the junior partner, almost a resource colony that provides raw materials to feed Chinese industry. Putin, who has built his political identity around restoring Russian greatness and sovereignty, finds this dynamic deeply troubling. Intelligence assessments suggest that he views long-term economic dependence on China as potentially even more dangerous than military confrontation with the West, because it gradually erodes Russian autonomy without firing a single shot. The energy sector illustrates this perfectly. After Western sanctions intensified following the invasion of Ukraine, Russia became even more dependent on China as a customer for its oil and gas. China has leveraged this dependency to negotiate extremely favorable prices, essentially forcing Russia to sell its energy resources at a significant discount. The Power of Siberia pipeline, which was supposed to be a symbol of mutually beneficial cooperation, has instead become a symbol of Russian weakness. Russia invested billions in the infrastructure, took on debt, and committed to long-term supply contracts, while China holds most of the bargaining power. If China decides to reduce purchases or demand even lower prices, Russia has very limited alternatives. Intelligence reports indicate that Putin's inner circle has discussed scenarios in which China essentially turns Russia into a resource appendage, similar to how some analysts describe certain African nations' relationships with China. The fear is that Russia could find itself trapped, too economically dependent on China to resist Chinese demands, but unable to develop alternative markets because of Western sanctions. This is a nightmare scenario for Russian strategic planners, and it's one that becomes more likely with each passing year as the economic gap between the two countries continues to widen. Military considerations add another layer to Putin's concerns about China. While Russia still maintains a substantial nuclear arsenal in terms of conventional military forces, the balance has shifted dramatically in China's favor. China's defense budget is now more than 3 times larger than Russia's, and the gap is growing. China has been modernizing its military at an astonishing pace, developing advanced technologies, expanding its navy, and building a professional fighting force that increasingly rivals American capabilities. Meanwhile, Russia's military, despite some areas of excellence, has shown significant weaknesses, as became painfully apparent during the early stages of the Ukraine conflict. Intelligence assessments from within the Russian Defense Ministry reportedly show deep concern about China's military buildup along the shared border. China has been upgrading infrastructure in its northeastern provinces, building new rail lines and roads that could support rapid military deployment, modernizing air bases within range of Russian territory, and conducting military exercises that, while officially focused on other scenarios, could easily be adapted for operations against Russia. The Russian military has quietly been preparing contingency plans for a potential Chinese attack, even as Putin publicly embraces President Xi Jinping and speaks of the Russia-China friendship having no limits. The technological dimension is equally concerning from a Russian perspective. China has rapidly emerged as a global leader in advanced technologies, including artificial intelligence, quantum computing, 5G telecommunications, renewable energy, and various other sectors that will define 21st century economic and military power. Russia, by contrast, has struggled to keep pace. The Russian economy remains heavily dependent on natural resource extraction, and efforts to diversify into high-tech sectors have had limited success. This technology gap means that in a long-term competition with China, Russia is playing from a position of increasing weakness. Leaked documents suggest that Russian intelligence services are particularly concerned about Chinese capabilities in cyber warfare and information operations. China has demonstrated sophisticated abilities to penetrate foreign networks, steal intellectual property, and conduct influence operations. For a country like Russia, which has its own authoritarian system to maintain, and which worries about internal stability, the prospect of Chinese interference is genuinely frightening. If China wanted to destabilize Russia, it has numerous tools at its disposal, from supporting opposition movements to exploiting ethnic tensions to simply overwhelming Russian defenses in the cyber domain. Let's talk about Central Asia, because this region represents another major source of tension between Russia and China, even if that tension is mostly hidden beneath the surface. Traditionally, Central Asia has been Russia's backyard, part of the former Soviet sphere of influence. Countries like Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan have maintained close ties with Moscow, both economically and in terms of security. But China's Belt and Road Initiative has fundamentally changed the dynamics in this region. Chinese investment has poured into Central Asia. Economic intelligence is particularly concerning. Chinese companies and investors have been quietly acquiring stakes in Russian businesses, infrastructure, and resources, often through complex corporate structures that obscure the true extent of Chinese ownership. Intelligence reports suggest that this could be a form of economic preparation, creating leverage that China could use in future negotiations or conflicts. If Chinese entities control significant portions of Russian infrastructure, they could potentially disrupt the Russian economy or even support Chinese military operations, by denying Russia access to its own resources. Cultural and soft power dimensions also factor into Russian concerns about China. While Russia has struggled to project cultural influence abroad, China has been investing heavily in soft power through Confucius Institutes, media operations, cultural exchanges, and educational programs. In regions like the Russian Far East and Central Asia, Chinese cultural influence is growing, potentially eroding the sense of connection to Russian language and culture. Over time, this could make it easier for China to exert influence or even to justify territorial claims based on the presence of Chinese cultural communities. There's also the question of ideology and political systems. Both Russia and China are authoritarian states, but they represent different models of authoritarianism. China's system appears more stable, more economically successful, and more capable of long-term planning than Russia's personalized autocracy centered around Putin. This creates an uncomfortable situation for the Russian leadership. If the Chinese model is seen as superior, it could undermine the legitimacy of Putin's rule and inspire either reforms or challenges from within the Russian elite. Intelligence reports suggest that Putin is aware of these comparisons and finds them deeply threatening. Climate change adds another dimension to the Russia-China relationship that increases Russian anxieties. As global temperatures rise, the Russian Far East and Siberia may become more habitable and agriculturally productive, while parts of northern China could face increasing water stress and environmental challenges. This could intensify Chinese interest in Russian territory as these lands become more valuable and as China faces growing pressure to secure resources and living space for its population. Russian strategic planners have reportedly modeled scenarios in which climate-driven migration and resource competition lead to increased Chinese pressure on Russian borders. The Arctic is another area of competition. As Arctic ice melts, new shipping routes and resource extraction opportunities are opening up. Russia has extensive Arctic territory and has been moving to assert control over these areas. But China has declared itself a near-Arctic state and has been investing in Arctic research, building icebreakers, and seeking access to Arctic resources and shipping routes. From Russia's perspective, this represents Chinese encroachment on what should be exclusively Russian domain, and there are concerns that China will eventually seek to challenge Russian Arctic claims, either directly or through international legal mechanisms. When we look at Russia's actual military deployments and strategic planning, the evidence of concern about China becomes even clearer. Despite the focus on Ukraine and tensions with NATO, Russia has maintained and even strengthened its forces in the Far East. Units that might seem needed elsewhere have been kept in the region, bases have been modernized, and exercises have been conducted that specifically practice defending against mechanized offensives from the east. This suggests that even in the midst of confrontation with the West, Russian military planners view the potential Chinese threat as too serious to ignore. Intelligence leaks have also revealed discussions within the Russian leadership about worst-case scenarios involving China. These include scenarios where China takes advantage of Russian weakness, perhaps if Russia becomes bogged down in a prolonged conflict with Ukraine, or if internal instability develops, to seize disputed territories or to impose unfavorable economic terms. There are reportedly contingency plans for how to respond to Chinese aggression, though the reality is that Russia's options would be limited, especially if it were simultaneously facing pressure from the West. The relationship between Putin and Xi Jinping adds a personal dimension to all of this. While the two leaders display friendship in public, intelligence assessments suggest a more complex private reality. Putin reportedly views Xi as a formidable and potentially dangerous rival, someone who leads a far more powerful country, and who operates from a position of strength that Putin can only envy. The personal chemistry may be cordial, but the underlying power dynamics create tension. Putin knows that he needs Xi more than Xi needs him, and this imbalance shaped Chinese companies have built infrastructure, and Chinese economic influence has grown exponentially. From Putin's perspective, this represents a direct challenge to Russian influence in what Moscow considers its near abroad. Intelligence reports indicate significant concern within the Kremlin about losing Central Asia to Chinese economic domination. If these countries orient themselves primarily toward Beijing rather than Moscow, it would represent a massive geopolitical defeat for Russia and would leave Russia even more isolated and vulnerable. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which includes both Russia and China, was supposed to be a platform for cooperation, but increasingly it looks like a vehicle for Chinese expansion into regions that Russia once controlled. There's also the question of China's long-term ambitions. While Chinese leaders speak about peaceful development and mutual benefit, Russian intelligence analysts take a more skeptical view. They see China as a rising power that will inevitably seek to expand its influence and secure its interests, potentially at Russia's expense. Historical analysis suggests that rising powers almost always come into conflict with neighboring states, and Russia's vast territories and resources make it a natural target for Chinese expansion, whether through economic means, demographic pressure, or eventually military force. Internal Russian government discussions, according to leaked sources, reveal a belief that China is simply biding its time, building its strength while maintaining friendly relations with Russia out of convenience rather than genuine partnership. The assessment is that once China feels sufficiently powerful and once the international situation is favorable, it could move to reclaim territories it views as historically Chinese, or at minimum, to reduce Russia to a subordinate position within a Chinese-led regional order. This is the kind of existential threat that keeps Putin and his advisors up at night, far more than concerns about NATO expansion or American military power. Now, you might be wondering, if Putin is so worried about China, why does he keep cultivating closer ties with Beijing? Why the joint military exercises, the energy deals, the diplomatic coordination? The answer is that Putin finds himself in a strategic trap. The deterioration of Russia's relationship with the West, accelerated by the annexation of Crimea and the war in Ukraine, has left Russia with few options. Putin needs China as a partner to avoid complete isolation, to maintain some degree of economic stability, and to present a united front against Western pressure. But this dependence on China is itself the source of his greatest long-term fear. This is the paradox of Putin's strategic situation. In the short term, he needs China, but in the long term, he fears China more than any other country. Intelligence assessments suggest that Putin is acutely aware of this dilemma and that it influences his decision-making in ways that aren't always visible from the outside. For example, his efforts to maintain some dialogue with Europe, his occasional overtures to countries like India and Turkey, his attempts to expand Russian influence in Africa and the Middle East, all of these can be understood partly as efforts to reduce dependence on China and create alternative partnerships. The nuclear dimension adds yet another layer of complexity. Russia's nuclear arsenal has long been the ultimate guarantor of its security and a symbol of its great power status. But even here, China is rapidly catching up. While exact numbers are classified, estimates suggest that China is significantly expanding its nuclear forces, potentially seeking rough parity with Russia and the United States. For Russia, which has relied on nuclear weapons to compensate for conventional military weaknesses, this is deeply troubling. If China achieves nuclear parity or superiority, one of Russia's key strategic advantages disappears. Moreover, the proximity of Russia and China means that nuclear weapons become a particularly dangerous factor in any confrontation. Unlike the US-Russia relationship, where vast oceans provide some buffer and warning time, a nuclear exchange between Russia and China would involve weapons striking targets within minutes, leaving almost no time for second thoughts or diplomatic intervention. This hair-trigger situation increases the risks of miscalculation or accidents, and Russian strategic planners are well aware of these dangers. Let's examine the intelligence community's perspective on all of this. Sources from within Russian intelligence services, including the FSB and GRU, reportedly indicate that China analysis has become one of the top priorities, consuming enormous resources and attention.